Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear friends and participants. Welcome to our first session in Ramadan of Quran 14 series. There is a very special connection between Quran and Ramadan, and that is that the Quran began to be revealed in the month of Ramadan. And it is precisely for this reason that fasting has been made incumbent upon Muslims in this month in order to express their gratitude, there's thankfulness before God. So Quran is a huge favor of God. So one of the reasons which we for which we fast in the month of Ramadan is because the Quran was actually revealed in this month. So in fact, this is the sole reason. So fasting could have been made incumbent in other months as well, but the reason that fasting has been made mandatory in the month of Ramadan is that the Quran began its revelation in the month of Ramadan. In fact, it was Laylatul Qadr, as we can gauge from the Quran itself, that this revelation started actually. And it started off with the revelation of the first surah of the Quran, which is Surah Fatiha, which is the first revealed surah. It is a surah of guidance. It is the surah in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was in fact given prophethood, and the rest of the Quran actually is a reply to the prayer or supplication of guidance which is found in Surah Fatiha. So we have been reading chapter number 6 of the Quran, and we started off with the Medinan surahs last time, which was the 57th surah, Surah Hadid, and today we'll go on to the next surah, which is the 58th surah or Surah Al-Mujadalah. So just to recap, I'm sure all of you must now be very well aware of this fact that every chapter of the Quran begins with a Meccan surah, one or more than one Meccan surah, and it ends on one or more than one Medinan surah. So, chapter number 6, which starts off with surah number 50, which is Surah Qaf, it goes to 56, which is Surah Waqiyah. So these 7 surahs are Meccan. And how do we know that a surah is Meccan? By its contents. So, therefore, in Meccan surahs, you'll find the idolaters, the polytheists being addressed, and their beliefs, and of course, their notions and all sorts of their views are brought into discussion, and they are told that they should give up polytheism because this is something which they have made up out of themselves. And then in the Medinan surahs, we'll find that a Muslim state has been set up, the state of Medina, the Prophet was its ruler. So, on the one hand, collective directives have been given to the Muslims in the Medinan surahs, and you'll find the people of the book and the hypocrites being addressed in the Medinan surahs a lot because when the Prophet shifted to Medina, the residents of Medina mostly belonged to Jews, and they were Jews and Christians, and obviously hypocrites as well, who had infiltrated within the ranks of the Muslims. So they are addressed, and uh, of course, then the final onslaught, which always takes place between the believers and disbelievers in the lives of messenger of God, is also depicted in these Medinan surahs. So remember, we have been discussing this, that for the messengers of God, there is always a lesser day of judgment, a day of judgment within our confines on this earth, which is set up for every messenger. And by this, it is actually meant that followers of messenger, they are rewarded, they are given dominance, and those who disbelieve in him, and of course here it's intentional disbelief, that they are punished in this very world. And this happened through natural calamities in the case of the previous prophets, for example, Prophet Lot, Prophet Shoaib, the nations of Ad and Samud. So they were destroyed by storms, cyclones, earthquakes, because of the fact they had intentionally denied. So this is something which always happens in the ministry of messengers of God. So it ends with their dominance. And this is the situation here as well in the case of the last prophet, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in this case, the difference is that if believers are afforded with the land where they can migrate and they are given political authority, then the punishment, which in former cases came through cyclones and earthquakes, it actually comes through the swords of the disbelievers, of the believers. So the believers actually take this task of punishing people who intentionally deny the truth. So I'm just trying to revise this concept because we have discussed this a lot of times, that it is fundamental. It's a fundamental thing to understand the Quran, that all those verses which speak of jihad and qital in this context, They actually are basically punishments of God through his messengers or through those natural disasters for people who had intentionally denied the truth. But this only takes place in the ministry of messengers. And this is a law which is specific to these messengers. It does not come into play once messengers have passed away. So this is of supreme importance, but that we make this distinction while reading the Quran, that a lot of things which are mentioned regarding this law of the messengers relates to the era of the messengers. It cannot be extended beyond that. And it is by not understanding this that we see people like Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar and their likes actually taking up the same course as Prophet Muhammad and his companions did, without realizing that it was their prerogative. They had this privilege from God. In fact, it was God who was punishing people through their messengers. And once this institution of messengerhood had ended, this prerogative can no longer be exercised. And if anyone does it, he actually willingly, intentionally or intentionally, he takes the role of playing God himself, which of course is something that has to be avoided at all costs. So, with this background, let us start our study with Surah number 58, which is Surah Al-Mujadalah. You'll find that this is in this Medinan Surah. One of the things which is discussed a lot is the infiltration of the hypocrites in the ranks of the Muslims. So these are hypocrites. They were professing faith with their tongues, but in fact they had a lot of doubt and disbelief in their hearts. So they were people who were just within the Muslim ranks for the reason of gaining certain benefits. Uh, and as far as the Quran itself is concerned, you see, because of the fact that the Almighty revealed it, so He exposes these hypocrites time and again and tells them that, well, this is the time that you can still mend your ways. This is the time that you can still, you can still be, if you bring yourself to the right path, you'll still be rewarded. You can still be taken up as God's servants and accepted in His ranks. So let's now start off with the surah. That's surah number 58, as I said, and I'll read the text, and then inshallah some of you would be reading the translation as well. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله والله يسمع تحاوركما إن الله سميع بصير.
Abdul Rafiq, can I request you that you can read the translation of the first verse?
In the name of God, the most gracious, the ever merciful. God has heard the word of the lady who was arguing with you about her husband and would continue to implore God. God was hearing the conversation of both of you. Indeed, God hears all and observes all.
Thank you very much, Abdul Rafi, for this lively reading. So, my dear friends and participants, this surah starts off with a small incident actually, and this is the case of a lady who we know by the name of Qala in Islamic history. So, was an incident which she faced from her husband actually, which is just coming up in the next paragraph, and she would come to the Prophet and she would actually ask her to resolve her issue. But because of the Prophet, that because of the fact that there was no clear guidance found till that time regarding the issue at hand, which we're just going to discuss in the next paragraph. The Prophet would, of course, keep on listening to her, and he would wait that God reveals something in her matter so that it can be conveyed. And it says here in this verse that Wallahu yasma'u tahawurakuma, that this conversation between the Prophet and that lady, which went on a couple of times, in which she would ask the Prophet that, well, her husband is doing such and such a thing, and so please help her. The Prophet, because of the fact that it has said that there was no clear guidance regarding the issue, so he would just listen to her and wait for God's guidance. And it seems that it is in this surah that this guidance was revealed, and God says that He's heard their conversation. As you can see, that word "hear," the word "hearing" actually here actually refers to the fact that He is intently listened to what has gone on, and would like to now suggest a way out. So it says, "In the Allah Sami'un Basir," God hears all and observes all. So it's just a phrase of assurance to the Prophet that don't worry, God's guidance is on the way. Okay. الذين يظاهرون منكم من نسائهم ما هن أمهاتهم إن أمهاتهم إلا اللائي ولدناهم وإنهم ليقولون منكرا من القول وزورا وإن الله لعفو غفور والذين يظاهرون من نسائهم ثم يعودون لما قالوا فتحرير رقبة من قبل أن يتماسا ذلكم توعزون به والله بما تعملون خبير.
Okay, we'll move on to Iman.
Those of you who do sihr with their wives, they do not become their mothers. Their mothers are only those who have given birth to them. Such people, however, utter words which are very despicable and false, and in reality, God, in spite of this, is very forgiving and merciful. Tell them, those who do sihr with their wives and afterwards wish to go back on what they said, then a slave should be liberated before they touch one another again. This is what you are being counseled of, and God is fully aware of all that you do.
Thank you, Iman, for this reading. So you see, there is uh, this thing called zihar, which existed in the times of Prophet and before his times as well. So zihar is a form of divorce, and what generally happens in zihar is that a person or a husband says, he pledges that as far as my wife is concerned, she is like my mother. So when someone says these words, it actually means that he has done zihar, and of course, any intimacy as a result is not possible because he has actually compared his wife to his mother, and this was actually a way of divorcing their wives and ultimately not having any intimacy with them. And this is precisely what happened with the Khala bint Sa'laba, as the lady that we were just discussing in the last paragraph. So her husband had actually come to her and said that, well, you are like my mother. And as I said, this was a way in which divorce would be pronounced, and it would be a signal for the fact that now there would be no intimacy between the two, and they're virtually separated. And this is what happened. So uh, till the time that conversation was taking place, as we have just seen in the previous paragraph, no clear directive had been revealed. It is now that the Almighty has revealed this directive and said that, well, if you do this, then this is a very bad thing. As you can see the words, it's very despicable and false. I mean, how can your wife become your mother? It is something that you should not do. But you see, because of the fact that this custom was deeply rooted and people were indulging it in a lot, so the Almighty actually pronounced a punishment for this. He said that this is something very, very, very unbecoming and evil. And he said that those people who do zihar with their wives, and they prohibit their wives upon themselves, and then they are feeling sorry. They would like to make amends. Then the Almighty says that this is not something very simple. If they have to make amends, if they have to correct themselves, then the first thing that they should do is they should, of course, repent and also liberate a slave before they become intimate with one another. So remember, in the times of Prophet Muhammad, slavery was an issue, and there were scores and scores of slaves which were found in various houses. And the Quran actually launched a campaign to liberate these slaves in a gradual way. And we have been discussing this in some of our other sessions that slowly and gradually slavery was eliminated. And one of the measures to do away with slavery was that the expiation or the atonement of certain sins was contingent upon releasing your slave if you would like to make an expiation of your sin. So this is one of the examples here, that in order to come back to your wives and in order to expiate, which is, of course, it means to atone for what you have done. The Almighty says that the first thing that you should do is you have to liberate your wives. So remember, this is something which is more of historical in nature. People no longer do zihar in this way. This was an age-old Arabic custom, and it was done away in the life of the Prophet himself. And this incident is actually continuing, and how the Almighty is telling us that as far as such a zihar, if has taken place, then how people should make amends for that. So the first thing was that they should liberate a slave, and coming up are some other measures which are suggested in case a person does not have a slave. So the words are فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعَيْنِ مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ يَتَمَاسَّ فَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَإِطْعَامُ 60 مِسْكِينًا ذَلِكَ لِتُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ وَتِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ وَلِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ.
Fatma or Riba, can one of you read the translation of this verse?
Then he who has no slave available shall fast 2 successive months before both touch one another. And he who does not have the capacity to do this shall feed 60 of the destitute before touching his wife. This is enjoined on you so that you may believe in God and his messenger the way they should be believed. And bear in mind that these are the bounds set by God. Only disbelievers cross them, and for the disbelievers there is a grievous punishment.
Thank you. So I assume this is Ariba.
It's Fatma.
Oh, it's Fatima. Okay. Jazakallah. Thank you, Fatima. So the punishment or the expiation of or the atonement of this sin is now further mentioned, and it's further opened up in this particular paragraph. It says that if a person does not have a slave, then he needs to fast 2 consecutive months for this. And if that is not available, and he is not in a shape to fast for 2 consecutive months, then he would be required to feed 60 needy people. And this is the atonement. This is what we call the expiation. This is something that he has to do before he becomes intimate with his wife once again. So as you can see, that this is how the whole incident has been depicted. And the reason for this depiction is that, you see, whenever you have an issue, I mean, it was an education, it was a guidance which was being provided at that time, that whenever there is an issue, the best thing is that instead of launching a whispering campaign, instead of producing or launching various scandals, it is best to come to the Prophet himself and ask if there is a problem. And actually, this is an example which is cited at the beginning of the surah, that this is the right way, that when there is a question in your mind, when there is something bothering you, then instead of making all kinds of objections or expressing your opinions here and there, the best thing is that since the Prophet of God is amongst you, go to him and ask this question. So basically, this was an example set by this lady for the rest of those weak Muslims and other people as well, that whenever you have an issue, just come to the Prophet and he is going to resolve that issue. And your own attitude should be in harmony in this way, and it should in no way be of any discord that you create by questioning anything, or by maybe expressing the fact, well, there is no clear guidance on a certain issue and what should I do. So it's like an example that was set in earlier on in the surah. Okay, now let's move ahead. إن الذين يحادون الله ورسوله كبتوا كما كبت الذين من قبلهم وقد أنزلنا آيات بينات وللكافرين عذاب مهين يوم يبعثهم الله جميعا فينبئهم بما عملوا أحصاه الله ونسوه والله على كل شيء شهيد.
Fatma Hussain, can I request you to read the translation of verse 5 and 6?
This was the attitude of this woman of servitude to God. On the other hand, those who are confronting God and his messenger shall be humiliated the way those before them of their sort have been humiliated. We have sent down clear arguments of this in the Qur'an, and for those disbelievers there is an utterly disgraceful torment. They should remember the day when God raises them all to life and informs them of each of their deeds. God has kept count of it and they have forgotten it, and God is watching over.
Okay, Jazakallah, and thank you, Fatma Hussain, for reading out this translation. So you see, this whole discourse is linked up to the previous paragraphs and says that just as this attitude which was adopted by this lady, by this woman, and she came over to the Prophet, this is the right way that you should actually adopt. But on the other hand, we find people who confront God and his messenger, and if they do so, they should remember that they shall be disgraced in this world, because God has made it incumbent upon his messengers that they shall succeed in this world, and their enemies are bound to doom. So this is how the Quran actually expresses its support for the believers and the messengers, and it tells them that ultimately they are going to triumph. And as far as these hypocrites are concerned, or these disbelievers are concerned, they should remember that one day they shall be raised before the Almighty, and he shall take account of their deeds. And they should not forget that God has kept count of every single deed, whether done in private or public, because he watches over everything. Such is the extent of his knowledge. So this is something which is presented time and again in the Quran that as far as God's knowledge is concerned, it is all embracing. Nothing misses out before Him. He knows what's going on in our hearts, He knows our intentions. And so, therefore, people must not think that they'll be let to go scot free. They shall be called to account. Okay. The next paragraph says, "Alam tara anna Allah ya'lamu ma fi samawati wa ma fil ard ma yakunu min najwa thalathatin illa huwa rabi'uhum wa la khamsatin illa huwa sadisuhum wa la adna min zalika wa la akthara illa huwa ma'ahum aynama kanu thumma yunabbi'uhum bima 'amilu yawm al-qiyamah inna Allah bikulli shay'in 'alim."
Ahsan, can you read the translation?
Have you not reflected that God knows everything of the heavens and the earth? It never happens that three converse secretly, and God is not the fourth among them, and five converse secretly, and God is not the sixth among them. Whether there are fewer than this or more, wherever they be, God is with them. Then, on the day of judgment, He will inform them of all their doings. Indeed, God has knowledge of all things.
Thank you, Hassan, for this reading. So you see, again, the knowledge of God and the fact that He has knowledge of everything is once again expressed here, and you can see and read between the lines to see that actually there was a whispering campaign which had been initiated by a lot of these hypocrites. They would come into the presence of Prophet Muhammad. They will sit beside him and they'll whisper each other. And this would actually, the reason of this whispering would be to cause dissension within that gathering, and people would actually look towards them that they are not attentive to the Prophet and they are talking to themselves, and their own conversation would be that they would be somehow plotting to topple the Prophet and cause harm to him. And when they would sit there and do these things, obviously the common Muslims would be alarmed, and this would create a lot of disorder in those gatherings. So it is here that the Almighty tells them that when you whisper, don't forget that whatever you whisper, whether you're three or four or five, God is always with you. Whether less in number, whether small in number, God is aware whatever you're whispering. So, and when He is aware, then one day He shall inform them of this whispering. And of course, this is going to take place on the day of judgment. But as you can see in the surah, as well as it progresses, that this shall be also done in this world. Because as far as God is concerned, Inna Allaha bikulli shay'in alim. God has knowledge of all things. Okay. The next paragraph is Alam tara ila allazina nuhu anin najwa summa ya'uduna lima nuhu anhu wa yatanajawna bil ithmi wal udwani wa ma'siyati rasul wa iza ja'uka hayyuka bima lam yuhayyika bihi Allah wa yaquluna fi anfusihim lawla yu'adhibuna Allah bima naqul hasbuhu jahannam yaslawnaha fa bi'sal masir.
Manahil, it's your turn.
Have you not seen those who, though forbidden from whispering, then they do what they have been forbidden? And whenever these people whisper, they whisper about usurping rights, transgression, and disobedience to the messenger. And, O Prophet, when they come to you, and they place salutations to you in words which God does not greet you with, and say in their hearts, if he is a prophet, why does God not punish us for what we say? Hell alone is sufficient for them. They will enter it, and it is a very evil abode.
Hell alone is sufficient for them. They will enter it, and it is a very evil abode. Again, as you can see, that the campaign of whispering was something which is again discussed in this paragraph, and these people would whisper. And now we can see the content of the whispering as well. What exactly was the content of their whispering is now mentioned here. That they would whispering like regarding usurping rights, which means that just taking away the rights of other people and not carrying them out. Transgression, of course, means to go beyond bounds in sinning and showing disobedience to the messenger. And one thing that they did was that they would come to the Prophet's presence and wish him Salaam Alaikum in a way that was absolutely uncalled for. And they would do by actually changing the spellings of the word. So you see, Assalamu Alaikum actually means to wish peace on the people that you come on to. But they would slightly change this and call and twist their tongue and the words that would actually come out of their mouth would be Assalamu alaikum. So you see, when you utter these words quickly, Assalamu alaikum, it's like Assalamu alaikum. And Assalamu alaikum with an alif after the sin actually means death. So Assalamu alaikum would mean death to you. So while Assalamu alaikum means peace to you, Assalamu alaikum would mean death to you. So they would quickly utter these words, and this is how they would actually cause nuisance and make fun of the Prophet, and think that they are some people who are basically at liberty to do whatever they like. And as the verse says, that they would even think in their hearts that why is it that God is not taking them to account if he's a prophet when they are saying such heinous words. So the Almighty says, well, this is all going to come in time. If he's not punishing them for this, then it is actually because of the fact that he is giving them respite, some time. And there are some people who might mend their ways, but once the time expires, God is going to get hold of them, and not only in this world but in the hereafter as well. So remember, this was a prank that it would play. It was a prank that they would pay salutations, say Assalamu alaikum in a way that it would sound as Assalamu alaikum, which means death to you. Obviously, this is something which was totally unbecoming of them, and the Almighty actually informed the Prophet that this is what they do. And in spite of this, uh, God is still giving them some time to mend their affairs. So, one thing that I'd like to point out here while we read the surah is that you see there are a lot of things which when you come into the Quran, you start reading it, you'll find that they are specific to the era of the Prophet. It's like reading his story and his biography, or his ministry, I would say, the way he undertook his preaching for those 23 years. And it actually is like a whole anecdote which is compiled in a historical sequence in which the Prophet, of course, was first in Mecca, then in Medina. So remember, when you pick up the Quran and you start reading the Quran, you should always think that basically it's an anecdote of the Prophet himself, the way he delivered his messages to the people who were right there in front of them. And as I said, in the Meccan period, there were mostly these idolaters, and in the Medinan period, they were the people of the book. Okay. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تناجيتم فلا تتناجوا بالإثم والعدوان ومعصية الرسول وتناجوا بالبر والتقوى واتقوا الله الذي إليه تحشرون إنما النجوى من الشيطان ليحزن الذين آمنوا وليس بضارهم شيئا إلا بإذن الله وعلى الله فليتوكل المؤمنون.
Maria Iqbal, please go ahead.
Believers, when you whisper with one another, do not whisper about usurping rights, transgression, and disobedience to the messenger. Instead, whisper about what is virtuous and pious, to keep fearing God before whom you will be gathered. Such whisperings are from Shaitan, so that he inflicts sorrow on the believers. Yet he cannot harm them in any way except by the will of God. And believers should put their trust in God in all circumstances.
Jazakallah. Thank you, Maria, for this reading. So again, that whispering campaign is discussed further, because you see what happened was that this was quite rampant in a certain time of the Prophet, and this was one of their ways to cause disruption in the society, especially, and of course in the gatherings of Prophet Muhammad. So one thing that you also might need to note here is that these hypocrites are still called believers, because the proper believers, of course, they would not indulge in these whispering campaigns. But because of the fact that these hypocrites had posed themselves to be Muslims and believers, so the Quran has actually not exposed them as yet, and it still calls them believers, and it still says that when you whisper to one another, don't whisper about these bad things and disobedience and transgression and usurping rights. If you have to whisper anything, then it has to be virtuous and pious, because this is how believers should be doing. And as far as these evil whisperings are concerned, they are from Satan, and they are meant to inflict sorrow on the believers. And then, my dear friends and participants, you might need to note one thing that these verses point out, especially the 10th verse. It says, وَلَيْسَ بِضَارِّهِمْ شَيْئًا إِلَّا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. Yet these whisperings cannot harm them in any way except by the will of God. So this is a principal statement. It tells us that whenever something bad happens to us, God actually lets it happen, and unless God lets it happen, nothing can happen in this way to us. So, in other words, if something is happening which is adverse, which we don't like, it is, of course, it is happening because of God's permission, because God is letting it happen. And the reason that He might be letting it happen could be various reasons. For example, at times He puts us to test and trial so that we come closer to Him. At times He wants to make us strong. At times He wants to make us realize that we have a lot of latent potentials which are hidden, and it is only in this time of crisis that those potentials can come to the surface. So these are a number of things, and at times also He wants to punish us for some things that we might have done in the past. So there are all these possibilities. So one thing that you have to note is that if there is something which has befallen you and you would not like it, or it's something bad, then remember it is because God has let that thing happen. That thing itself cannot have the power to disturb or disrupt you. It's only when God lets it happen for certain reasons that it does happen. And therefore, the verse ends by saying, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَلْيَتَوَكَّلِ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, and believers should put their trust in God in all circumstances. Because if they are good circumstances, they are from God. If they are bad circumstances, even they are from God. Both are a means of trial and test. And trial and test, my dear friends and participants, is something which is fundamental to our life in this world. Every single person amongst us is being tried and tested, either through good circumstances or through these bad circumstances. And this is the philosophy of life. This is the crux of life. And if we are not able to understand this, then you see a lot of things that emanate from a misunderstanding of these facts actually develop in the form of philosophies, ideologies, and even religions. So one of the things which atheists or people who don't believe in God often present is that why is evil found in this world? If God is just and if He's so merciful, so why do we find so much oppression and so much injustice in the society? And again, one of the founders of a great religion, Buddhism, Buddha, he himself felt this, and he said that this world is not a place in which we should contribute ourselves into. We should just sideline ourselves. We should become ascetics. And for him, this problem of evil could have only been solved if we just leave this world and enter into a certain phase of trance and lead our lives separately and have nothing to do with the business of the world. So you see how important this is to realize that if there are things which might bother us in this world, then they are basically from God, and the purpose is not to disgrace us or humiliate us or cause us any problem per se, but the purpose is to test our mettle. And if we understand this, a lot of things can be clipped in their bud, as they would say. You can nip the evil in the bud by understanding that if this thought is progressed, if this thought continues, then it can land you in trouble by actually making you feel that God is not merciful, He's not taking care of us, and therefore, why should we believe in God in the first place? So, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu iza qila lakum tafassahu fil majalisi fafsahu yafsahillahu lakum wa iza qila anshuzu fanshuzu yarfa'illahu allazina amanu minkum wallazina utul ilma darajat wallahu bima ta'maluna khabir.
Muhammad Ahmed, please go ahead and read the translation.
Believers do indulge in whispering. They sit closely together in groups. So make room in gatherings of the Prophet. When you are bidden to do so, God will make room for you. And when it is said, get up, then you should get up. God will elevate to high ranks those among you who have accepted faith and who are given knowledge. And rest assured, God is fully aware of all that you do.
Jazakallah. Thank you, Muhammad Ahmed, for this reading. So the surah continues once again in the same vein, in the same tone. And as you can see that the gatherings of the Prophet, his assemblies are being discussed. And so what we can see or gather from the previous parts is that these hypocrites and these weak Muslims would come into these gatherings and they would start whispering. And they would launch a whispering campaign in which there were all sorts of the evil things that they would just whisper. And one of the things that they would do is that they would sit very close to one another, because this would make possible that whispering. So in order to circumvent this, in order to stop this, believers are given this directive that, well, when you sit in the company of the Prophet, make space, make room. Don't sit huddled up. If you huddle up with one another, you are very close to one another. Of course, there is always this chance that you start talking to one another and whispering one another, and don't realize that you are in the company of the Prophet, who might be reciting a Quran, a Quranic verse or something which is important for them. And at times when they are told to get up, they should get up, because this is how God is going to elevate their ranks. They should not feel as if they have been let down by the Prophet in any way if he has asked them to leave his presence. And for such people, God, of course, says that they should rest assured that God is fully aware of what they do. And as far as all those who have accepted faith, God shall elevate their ranks. He said, raise their ranks. And they are people who have been given knowledge. Of course, knowledge here means true knowledge, knowledge of the comprehension of God, knowledge of how this world has been created, how we have been brought in this world, what is our purpose, and what will become of us when we die. So this is, in contrast, another, you can say, attitude which the Quran has advised us and urged us to adopt, of course, in the times of the Prophet. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا ناجيتم الرسول فقدموا بين يدي نجواكم صدقة ذلك خير لكم وأطهر فإن لم تجدوا فإن الله غفور رحيم.
Nida Aziz, please go ahead.
Believers, a restriction is now imposed on you. When you intend to converse in private with the messenger, give some charity before such conversation. This is better and also more noble for you. However, if you lack the means, God is forgiving and ever merciful.
Okay, Jazakallah. Thank you, Nida, for reading this out. So you see, the issue is still continuing here, and now a step ahead has been taken. So these hypocrites, they would take an appointment with the Prophet, and they would come close to him, and they would, of course, try to harass him and tease him and say all sorts of words. So in order to discourage this practice, they are told that, well, if you have to come and meet the Prophet, then you must give some money in charity. This was like a restriction so that people would not just barge into coming in the presence of the Prophet, and they would do a certain thing or a duty before they come into his presence. And obviously, it was meant to discourage them. So this is better and more noble for you. However, if you lack the means, God is forgiving and merciful. People, if are not able to give in charity, then they would be given this concession. Again, my dear friends and participants, you can see that the word believers is still used for these hypocrites. So you see, the Quran at times does not, and many a time, it does not expose these hypocrites until right at the end. It still speaks of them as believers, because this is how they pose themselves. So the Quran accepts their accepts what they say on their face value, whatever they say. So this is important to note here, that as far as the Prophet himself was concerned, in meeting him in private would require a certain amount of decorum, and of course this was meant for people to consider that if they have to really come into the presence of the Prophet, then it has to be something very serious. أَأَشْفَقْتُمْ أَن تُقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيْ نَجْوَاكُمْ صَدَقَاتٍ فَإِذْ لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا وَتَابَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكُمْ فَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَاللَّهُ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ.
Raheel, I will request you to read the translation, verse number 13.
Has fear overcome you that you will have to give in charity before conversing in private? So when you do not do this, and God had mercy on you so that he lifted the restriction, then now be diligent in the prayer. Keep saying the zakah and adhere to obedience of God and his messenger. And bear in mind that God is aware of all that you do.
So, Jazakallah, thank you, Raheel, for reading this out. Now, you see, it seems that this directive actually bothered many people, especially the true believers who were not very fluent, and it was difficult for them to always give in charity. So it seems also that these hypocrites were also discouraged after some time. So you can see here is a classical example of how a directive has been repealed, which was in force in the previous verse, and it has now been abrogated, it has been discontinued, and the Almighty tells them, well, if you repent on this behavior, then this restriction has been lifted, and now you should be more diligent in the prayer, you should be diligent in paying zakat, you should be very, very careful in observing what God and his messenger would like you to follow, because you should remember that God is aware of all that you do. So you see, once again, the whole surah is now speaking of how these hypocrites had actually made life miserable for a lot of people. And when they were called and checked, and a certain restriction was imposed, it was not only something which made it difficult for them actually to come to the God's presence, but at the same time, believers who didn't have the means to do charity, they were also put to test. So after a while, when they were instructed and they had gained this guidance, this directive of giving charity, and then coming into the presence of the Prophet has been repealed or done away with. Okay. Alam tara ila allazina tawallaw qawman ghadiba Allahu alayhim ma hum minkum wala minhum wa yahlifuna ala al-kadhibi wa hum ya'lamun أعد الله لهم عذابا شديدا إنهم ساء ما كانوا يعملون اتخذوا أيمانهم جنة فصدوا عن سبيل الله فلهم عذاب مهين.
Ryan, it's your turn.
Have you not seen those who befriend people who have incurred the wrath of God? They belong neither to you nor to them, and they intentionally swear to their falsehood that they are with you. God has prepared for them a grievous torment. Evil indeed is that which they are doing. They use their oaths as a shield. Thus, they have desisted from the path of God. So for them is a humiliating torment.
Jazakallah. Thank you, Rayan Wahidi, for reading this out. Now, you see, one of the things that you might note is a term in the Quran which is used a lot for the Jews of the times of the Prophet Muhammad. So that is Ghazibullah. You must be remembering that in Surah Fatiha, you say Ghairul Maghzubi alayhim. So Maghzub and Ghazabat, they are, of course, the same forms. So this actually is a reference to the Jews of the Prophet Muhammad's time. So whenever you find these words, Ghaziba or Yaghzibu or Maghzub, which means people who have incurred the wrath of God, people who with whom God is angry with. So you'll find that they generally refer to the Jews of Prophet's times, and this distinction has to be made. That, of course, the Jews of the Prophet's times, not of all times, are being discussed. So it says that they are people who are not neither among them or nor among you, which of course means that they have this tendency of hypocrisy, and they intentionally swear on falsehood, which they swear false oaths, and they have been told that remember that they'll not just go away like this. God is going to call them to account. There is a grievous punishment for them, and bad is what they do. And what they do is they swear these false oaths and they make these false oaths to be a shield. And of course, one day this is something which is going to be exposed, and there is going to be a disgraceful torment for them. So these hypocrites, which were found in the ranks of the Muslims, you can see that some of them belong to the Jews. But remember, this word Ghazibullah in most cases in the Quran, as I said, is used for the Jews of the times of the Prophet, not of all times. Okay, لن تغني عنهم أموالهم ولا أولادهم من الله شيئا أولئك أصحاب النار هم فيها خالدون يوم يبعثهم الله جميعا فيحلفون له كما يحلفون لكم ويحسبون أنهم على شيء ألا إنهم هم الكاذبون استحوذ عليهم الشيطان فأنساهم ذكر الله أولئك حزب الشيطان ألا إن حزب الشيطان هم الخاسرون.
Sai, please go ahead.
Neither their wealth nor their children will in any way be able to protect them from this torment of God. They are the inmates of hell. They will abide in it forever. On the day when God raises all of them to life, they will swear all sorts of oaths before Him, as they now swear before you, and will think that they also have a basis. Listen, in reality, it is they who are liars. Satan has overpowered them and has made them forget God's remembrance. They are the faction of Satan. Listen up, this faction of Satan alone is going to be the loser.
Jazakallah Saim for reading this passage out for us. So again, their punishment and this harsh and the strong words that you can clearly see from this paragraph, that these hypocrites from the Jews, they should not think that they will not be called to account. They are the people who would be burning in hellfire later on. And if they are swearing these false oaths, remember that this is something which is not going to augur well for them. And the reason is that they have taken to telling lies, and Satan has got the better of them and has made them forget God. And one thing that you can see here is that they are classified as a category, that they are Hizb Shaitan, which means that they are the faction of Satan. They are the group of Satan. And as far as the faction or the group of Satan is concerned, then he is going to end up, that faction is going to end up as a loser, and they are not going to succeed. إن الذين يحادون الله ورسوله أولئك في الأذلين كتب الله لأغلبن أنا ورسلي إن الله قوي عزيز.
Sana Iqbal, please go ahead and read the translation.
You should know that those who show enmity to God and His Messenger, it is they who shall be humiliated the most. This is because God has decreed, I and my messengers are destined to be dominant. In reality, God is extremely powerful and very mighty.
Thank you, Sana. Again, you see there is this strong message which is being given out to these opponents of the Prophet, that they must realize that for the time being they might think that they are succeeding, but ultimately they should know that those who show this animosity to God and His Messenger, they will always end up as losers. They shall be disgraced in this world. And this is the law of the Almighty. Kataballahu la'aghlibanna ana wa rusuli, which means that God has decreed, He has made it incumbent, He has made it mandatory that I and my messengers are destined to be dominant. So there is not going to be any other result out of this. And in Allah Qawiyyun Aziz, in reality, God is extremely powerful and mighty. لا تجدوا قوما يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر يوادون من حاد الله ورسوله ولو كانوا آباءهم أو أبناءهم أو إخوانهم أو عشيرتهم أولئك كتب في قلوبهم الإيمان وأيدهم بروح منه ويدخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه أولئك حزب الله ألا إن حزب الله هم المفلحون. So this is the last paragraph of the surah, and now inshallah we'll be discussing the contents once one of you reads out the translation.
Sine, it's your turn.
You will not see those who truly believe in God and in the last day on friendly terms with those who have become enemies of God and His Messenger, even though they be their fathers, sons, brothers, or members of family. It is these people who in hearts God has stamped faith and helped them with a special blessing of His own. And on the day of judgment He will admit them to orchards below which streams flow. They will dwell therein forever. God was pleased with them, and they were pleased with Him. They are the faction of God. Listen, it is only God's faction which will succeed.
Thank you, Sine, for this reading. So once again, you see that there is a comparison which can be gauged from this paragraph and the last paragraph. You see the last paragraph talked about the faction of Satan, Hizb Shaitan. And this paragraph, on the opposite, talks about the group or the faction of God. It's called Hizbullah. So Hizbullah and Hizb Shaitan, the faction of Satan and the faction of God, they are contrasted. They are compared to one another, that as far as God's faction is concerned, even if they are closest relatives, like for example their fathers, mothers, sons and members of the family, they are enemies of God and His Messenger, then they are not on friendly terms with such people. And it is these people regarding whom God says that I have stamped my blessing and helped them. And on the day of judgment, they will enter paradise, the paradise whose picture has been depicted in various ways in the Quran. And they are given these glad tidings that they will dwell therein forever. God is pleased with him and they are pleased with God. And they are called the faction of God, and the faction of God is always going to succeed. So this brings us to an end to this discussion, my dear friends and participants, that as far as the surah is concerned, just to sum up, remember that when you pick up the Quran, when you start reading the Quran, one of the important things is that it is going to discuss a certain part of the Prophet's life. The Quran is basically an anecdote. It's a story which depicts the Prophet's life, his various phases in which he delivered his message to the believers and disbelievers at the same time. In Mecca, they were basically the idolaters. In Medina, they were basically the people of the book. So you'll find these things being mentioned in the Quran. And you'll find how the Prophet dealt with them. You'll find how these people behaved with him. and how the Almighty gave them so much latitude, you can clearly see that in spite of these subversive activities, such is the mercy of God that He has still not exposed these hypocrites to the ultimate. The Almighty still calls them believers. He does not address them as munafiqun or hypocrites, even in such an instance, which shows how extremely God is disposed towards mercy, and He would like them to be given one chance after the another. And at the same time, God Almighty also, on behalf of His prophets, and of course here regarding Prophet Muhammad, uh, asks the Prophet to take certain measures in order to circumvent these subversive activities. And also remember that Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, in spite of being a great prophet, he was a human being, and he needed to be assured, he needed to be given this assurance that, well, God is with him, and if these hypocrites or these disbelievers are causing nuisance in his gatherings, then don't worry, God is going to take full control of this, and He's going to set right matters. So when you pick up the Quran and you read through the Quran, always remember that you'll be reading some part of the Prophet's life, not his personal life, but his life which was spent in delivering the message of God. Okay, now since we have just read the surah, let's just revise some parts of it through some certain questions that I'd like to ask you. Obviously, if you have any question, I'm there for you to answer this. But my question to you, my first question to you would be that there is a certain tradition or a certain custom, I can say, which is mentioned in the very first part of this surah, and it was like a divorce. So, does anyone remember what the name of that custom is? What the Quran tells us regarding the name of that custom, which was a form of divorce?
Zihar.
Absolutely correct, Zoha. That's wonderful. So, zihar. Okay, Maryam Idris, can I ask you what exactly was zihar? I mean, it was a form of, but what would a person do in zihar?
It's is it relating to mother?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you see, you're close to it, Mariam. Thank you. So you see, what people would do in those times is that they would call their wives as their mothers. And because, of course, you cannot be intimate with your mothers, it was a form of severing or breaking your ties as a wife with the husband. You could no longer be intimate. So, because of the fact that obviously you can never be intimate with your mothers. So, it's like telling your wives that you are now going to cut off your relations with them. So, they would say that, well, you are like my mother, and this was a form of a separation that would be pronounced, and this was pre-existing. I mean, it was Islam inherited it, the Quran inherited it. It was already found in the society, and because of the fact that people were misusing it, that it was brought to the Prophet's notice, and the Prophet, of course, was very worried because you see, Khala bint Salaba, who is the lady about whom we find that she was arguing with the Prophet in a very loving way, in a very affectionate way, that please tell me how I can deal with my husband. And this is the solution which the Almighty actually revealed to the Prophet. And this also gives us this picture that many a times people would come to the Prophet for a solution, and he would not be having a solution because that solution required God's revelation or interference from God. And he would wait for a revelation so that some solution would be presented. And this is a classic case at how someone came to the Prophet. There was not a solution till that time. And when this went on, the Almighty revealed that solution and then actually preserved this incident in the Quran. Why? Because the attitude which has to be adopted when there is a question in your mind is now correctly depicted. That this is how you should be. Instead of going into a whispering campaign, instead of causing dissension in the society, people of those times were required that this is the right way. So the hypocrites basically are in the background. The Quran is addressing them that look how this lady was so fervent, she was so passionate that she would come to the Prophet time and again, and she would not indulge in any whispering. So the right attitude is basically spelled out. Once again, something which is very, very close, or I would say very, very specific to the era of the Prophet. Okay, one more question that I'd like to ask is that there is this, there was a certain restriction which was imposed on people if they wanted to chat with the Prophet in private. So, what was that restriction? Does anyone remember? We just discussed that. There was a certain restriction that before coming to the Prophet's presence in private, if you had to whisper something to him in private or say something to him in private, because of the fact that this was causing a nuisance. So the Almighty at one instant actually imposed a certain restriction. So does any one of you remember that restriction?
When you
Seen it?
intend to
Okay.
converse in private with the
Uh-huh.
messenger, give some charity before such conversation.
Correct. Correct, Abdul Rafi. Wonderful. Well done. So yes, this was the restriction imposed, that they were told that they must spend some money in charity, and unless they do so, they would not be permitted to come into God's into the presence of God's prophet. So thank you very much, my dear friends and participants, for being part of this Quran study. Just a couple of things that I'd like to remind you, maybe which might prove useful in this holy month of Ramadan. Remember, this month is a very blessed month. This month is a month in which we are able to come closer to God. We can reap the blessings of this month. And the best way to do so is have a very close contact with the Quran. So try to make it a habit, at least in these remaining part of Ramadan, if not, of course, in the rest of your life, that you spend 5 or 10 minutes every day in reading the Quran with a good translation, any translation. Not, I mean, you don't have to pick up a translation. There are so many apps that you can find on iStore or on Apple Store, everywhere that you'll find that there are apps in which you can just listen to the reading of the Quran in Arabic and follow it up with a translation. So if you're able to do this, you'll be able to find that your connection with God, your connection with the Quran is building up, and this is what we need to do. And these sessions, of course, are also meant to stimulate you, that you need to have that God connection. Remember, every one of us needs God, because we are people who we become sad, we become depressed, we need help, and there's no greater a help, no better a help than the Almighty Himself. And the best way to obtain that help, is to remain close to Him. So pick up the Quran, read the Quran, listen to the Quran. That is the best utility that you can have of Ramadan. And the second thing that you might do is to read the tahajjud prayer at night, which is just before your sahur, when you eat your sahur or your sehri. So if you can just read 3 witrs that you often read with the Isha prayer, don't read them with the Isha prayer, just leave them for the sahur time. It'll hardly take you 5 minutes, maybe even less. So that's the minimum quantity of the tahajjud prayer. If you can offer the tahajjud prayer, you'll find out that this is something of a huge benefit to you, because the Quran tells us that this is the time when the Almighty is closest to our hearts. He is very attentive to our prayers. If we have any desires, if we have any wishes, then the best time to call upon God is the tahajjud time, the time just before your fast begins. And that is the time that you can remember God. So this is a bonus that you're getting. Most of you would be up even at Sehri, and most of you would sleep after Sehri. Or if you get up at Sehri, just make it 5 more minutes before you get up, I mean, before you eat Sehri, and offer that prayer. And last but not the least, be as much as you can attentive to the needs of others. There are so many people in your surroundings. There are so many charities, and of course, there are so many afflictions that we find going on in all parts of the world. If you are able to donate your money, whatever you have collected, maybe to a lot of charities, a lot of causes, that would be wonderful, because being charitable, being generous, again, is something which is absolutely required. And you'll find that for your own mental peace, or mental comfort, that you have done something for people, you have contributed something for people. So contribution, thinking of other people, and reminding yourselves that you are blessed. You are people who have one of the best lifestyles. You go to the best school, you wear the best dress, you have the best food to eat, you have the best cars to travel in, you have the best education, you have the best health facilities at your disposal. So the best thing would be that you share these blessings and think of other people. And this is the best way that you can celebrate Ramadan, by being compassionate and forgiving to other people. So thank you very much. So inshallah, we'll see each other again once this week passes, next Sunday. Until then, take care, and it is bye bye, Khuda Hafiz from your teacher.